We'll move on to another topic in just a few hours. 5 Taliban militants who were released by the U.S. last year in an exchange for U.S. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl could be free to travel. Ever since their release from Guantanamo Bay last May, they have been living in Qatar under surveillance. But their one-year travel ban is about to expire. The worry for the U.S.? Well, they could return to the battlefield in Afghanistan. CNN's Nick Valencia is here with much more on that. I know that all weekend the U.S. has been holding these negotiations with the governments of Afghanistan and Qatar to try and extend this travel ban. How are those talks going? Do we know?
Senior administration officials say all weekend these talks have been going on between the U.S. government, Qatari government, as well as Afghanistan's government. Last we heard on Friday from some diplomatic sources is that where was supposed to be a decisive meeting held between the Qataris and the Americans on Saturday, the details of that have still not been made public, but that hasn't stopped the chatter surrounding the controversy of the so-called release of the Taliban 5. Earlier today on State of the Union, retired four-star Army General Stanley McChrystal talked about the controversy of the trade for Bo Bergdahl and what happens next for the Taliban 5.
It's important to get him back. I think now we got to move forward. We got to decide what we deal with. The 5 that are back, presumably they'll go back to the battlefield, but they won't change the dynamics. It's not going to change the balance of effort there, 5 guys, but it's just something we got to watch as we go forward.
We wanted to introduce you more specifically to these 5 individuals that the U.S. relinquished to secure Bergdahl's release. They were mostly mid to high-level officials within the Taliban. One of them, Faisal, was the chief army staff under the Taliban regime, accused of war crimes during Afghanistan's civil war in the 90s. Another, Nouri, has denied his role and importance and level of access to Taliban officials. Wazik is the third, reportedly also an al-Qaeda intelligence member. He has denied links to any terror groups and contends that he was detained actually while trying to help U.S. officials find and locate senior Taliban leaders. A fourth, Omari, was a minor Taliban official and the Taliban's chief of communications. And perhaps the most high profile is Kirhwa, who was said to be an early member of the Taliban with direct ties to Osama bin Laden. Of course, as you mentioned, Randy, the concern is that they will rejoin the Taliban and strengthen that group.
Yeah, I was watching that Stanley McChrystal interview with Jim Sciutto on State of the
Terrific
Union, and
interview,
it was a great interview, but he was alarming by saying it's presumed they'll go back to the battlefield. But the one thing I did take away from it was the fact that he said, these guys have been out of the game for a long time, and maybe they're not going to go back to be the leaders that they were. So let's hope that that is the case.
That's a great point.
Yeah, but Nick, thank you very much.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Randy.
the update. All right, let's talk more about this. Joining us now, former Navy SEAL and former FBI Special Agent Jonathan Gilliam and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, who once oversaw the Army's Human Intelligence Program. Colonel Shaffer, how serious a threat are these Taliban leaders, do you think?
Well, I disagree with Stan McChrystal. I respect the general. He's in my book, Operation Dark Heart, but he's wrong. They're like rock stars. If they don't go directly back to the battlefield, there will be a great psychological edge to the Taliban, and we're still in combat with them. So I think we have to take very seriously the potential of their return. I would like to see their presence in Qatar extended, and I think we have to do more to actually try to figure out what we're going to do to monitor them. Qatari do not want to have any additional surveillance put on them, but I think it's in our interest to figure out what's going to happen with them, because again, everything I've talked to very senior leaders, one of which who worked for Stan McChrystal, said that these guys will put a great deal of wind back in the sails of the Taliban should they get back.
Jonathan, let me ask you about this report by the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, saying that one of the Taliban 5 actually contacted militants, and Senator Lindsey Graham said at least one of the men met with members of an al-Qaeda-affiliated group. I mean, isn't that a huge red flag?
Well, I think, as Colonel Shaffer was just saying there, this whole thing is a red flag. The real red flag here, though, is that we don't have a handle on the way that we're fighting this war on terror globally and here at home. I mean, why did we have to release these 5 particular people? Well, they were chosen by the Taliban. And I think what we're seeing is things that are not thought through, like the Patriot Act expiring. Why are we allowing that to expire? Why aren't we discussing it and figuring out what's good and what's bad about it? Why are these things politicized? It makes no sense whatsoever. And I agree with Colonel Shaffer. I disagree with General McChrystal on this, because here's the thing. Look at al-Baghdadi. He was nothing, and he went to a prison, and by the time he came out of there, he was the head of ISIS.
And Colonel, Qatar and U.S. officials have been meeting, but so far it doesn't sound like there's a deal yet to extend the travel ban. I mean, what kind of pressure can the U.S. bring to bear to force a deal? What can they do?
Well, a great deal. I mean, Qatar depends on us for a great deal of economic support. And Jonathan is spot on. I mean, he said it right there. We don't have a plan. I can't believe, State Department started negotiating 3 days before the travel ban expires. This is totally insane. And we don't have an idea of what these guys would do. And again with Jonathan completely. We see guys go back all the time to the battlefield after having been detained and take up huge leadership roles because they're seen like Mick Jagger in their circles. They don't have to be current. They have to be effective. So I think we have to be very clear here going forward of what we expect to occur when these things happen again. And I think it was a bad trade. Five 4-star generals for one individual who will probably be held accountable to have deserted this post. I just don't think I don't think we know what we're doing.
Yeah, let me ask you about another topic. Let me change focus here to ISIS in Iraq. I mean, this is brand new video that we have here released by the Iraqi Defense Ministry that shows the country's military bombarding ISIS in Anbar province with airstrikes. You see it right there. Colonel, to you again on this. We've seen airstrikes from coalition forces aimed at ISIS for months now. This strike is from the Iraqi Air Force. Is this a sign that they're getting stronger and could be more successful in the fight against ISIS?
Well, they have to be. I mean, there's no doubt here when you see large armies massing in open, broad daylight, you have to do something. I think Ash Carter's comments were true. I think the Iraqi army has to get its act together. I think we should do more to motivate it, though. We have to figure out who we can work with. I think we've underutilized the Peshmerga, and I think we've underutilized our own Air Force. We're running 3 to 5 sorties a day. We should be doing 100 a day to be effective.
Jonathan, what's your take?
Well, I think Colonel Shaffer could absolutely agree and tell you that if we just allow these other host nation individuals to fight their own war, and we're not over there at least advising them and sometimes actually leading them into battle, you're just fighting skirmishes because nobody fights like we fight. And
absolutely,
they're really good at fighting in their area of operations and maybe their village, but once they step out of that area, just throwing bombs down range does nothing. And again, I know it looks like success maybe for the Iraqis, but to me, it just looks like another Band-Aid in a bad foreign policy or a bad war plan, I guess you could say overall.
Great to have you both here. Great discussion. Thank you, Jonathan Gilliam and Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer.
Thank you.
And we will be right back.